There is a conversation happening inside their mind that nobody else can hear. A message they have written countless times without ever pressing send. A message they have imagined delivering in different ways, at different moments, with different words. Yet every time they get close to sharing it, something stops them. They close the message. They put the phone away. They tell themselves that maybe tomorrow will be the right time. But deep down, they know this is not just a simple message. It carries emotions they have been protecting for far too long. For a while, they believed staying silent was the easier choice. They thought distance would make the feelings weaker. They thought time would naturally remove the need to say what was left unsaid. But instead, something unexpected happened. The longer they kept those words inside, the more powerful they became. The message they tried to ignore continued returning to their thoughts, reminding them that there was still something unfinished between you. What makes this even more surprising is that they are not afraid because they do not know what they want to say. In fact, they already know. They have replayed those words in their minds so many times that they almost feel familiar. The hesitation comes from something deeper. They are afraid of what happens after the message is sent. They are afraid of the vulnerability that comes with finally revealing what they have been carrying. They are afraid that once those feelings are expressed, everything they have tried to control may change. And listen to this, because recently, something inside them has started shifting. The same fear that once kept them silent is no longer as strong as it used to be. The desire to be honest is becoming louder. The need to express what has been hidden is becoming harder to ignore. They are beginning to realize that sometimes the weight of unspoken feelings becomes heavier than the fear of speaking them. For so long, they have protected themselves by remaining quiet. But now they are starting to question whether that silence is truly protecting them or simply keeping them away from something they deeply want. Because the message they have been afraid to send is not disappearing. It is waiting. And with every passing moment, it is becoming more difficult for them to keep holding back the words their heart has been trying to release. And listen to this, because there is a reason they have kept this message locked away for so long. It is not because they do not care. It is not because the words are difficult to find. In fact, the truth is quite the opposite. The reason they have struggled to send it is because the message means so much to them. When emotions run deep, even the simplest words can feel incredibly risky. Every sentence carries the possibility of changing something. Every honest confession carries the possibility of being misunderstood. And that uncertainty has been enough to keep them silent. For a long time, they convinced themselves that saying nothing was the safest option. If they never sent the message, they would never have to face disappointment. If they never expressed their feelings, they would never have to deal with rejection. Silence gave them a sense of control. It allowed them to keep imagining possibilities without having to confront reality. As long as the message remained unsent, they could protect themselves from answers they might not be ready to hear. But lately, that sense of safety has started to feel different. What once felt like protection now feels more like a prison. Every time they think about reaching out, they feel a mixture of fear and relief at the same time. Fear because they do not know how things will unfold. Relief, because a part of them is tired of carrying these unspoken thoughts alone. The emotional burden has become heavier than they expected. The words they tried to suppress continue demanding attention, and ignoring them no longer feels as easy as it once did. And listen to this. One of their biggest fears has always been timing. They wonder if too much time has passed. They wonder if circumstances have changed beyond recognition. They wonder whether the message would still matter the way it once might have. These questions have replayed in their mind countless times. Every possible scenario has been examined. Every possible outcome has been imagined. Yet despite all that analysis, one thing remains unchanged. The desire to communicate never disappears. There have been moments when they opened a message window and simply stared at the screen. The words were there. The feelings were there. The intention was there. But then doubt appeared. What if they say the wrong thing? What if the response is colder than they hope? What if expressing themselves creates more uncertainty instead of clarity? These fears have stopped them repeatedly. Yet every time they walk away, they find themselves returning to the same place again. What surprises them most is that the fear itself is beginning to lose its power. Not because the risks have disappeared, but because the emotions behind the message have become stronger. The need for honesty is slowly overtaking the need for protection. The desire for clarity is becoming more important than the comfort of uncertainty. And that shift is changing everything. Recently, they have started realizing that silence comes with its own consequences. Every day they choose not to send the message, another day passes without answers. Another day passes, wondering what could happen if they simply found the courage to be honest. That realization has become impossible to ignore, because while fear once convinced them to stay quiet, they are beginning to understand something important. Fear may protect a person from rejection, but it also protects them from connection. And now they are starting to question whether remaining silent is truly worth the price they have been paying all along. And listen to this, because something important is happening inside them now. The message they have been holding back is no longer just a thought that appears occasionally. It has become something much more powerful. What began as a quiet feeling has grown into a constant presence. No matter how hard they try to focus on other things, the emotions behind those unsent words continue finding their way back into their heart and mind. They are beginning to realize that this is no longer about a single message. It is about everything that message represents. For a long time, they believed they could simply wait for the feelings to fade. They assumed that enough time, enough distractions, and enough distance would eventually make the desire to reach out disappear. But instead of becoming weaker, the emotions have become clearer. The more they try to move forward without expressing what they feel, the more aware they become of what they are carrying. It is like trying to ignore a voice that grows louder every time it is silenced. Lately, thoughts of you have been appearing more frequently than usual. Sometimes it happens unexpectedly. A memory surfaces out of nowhere. A familiar feeling returns. A small reminder triggers a wave of reflection they were not prepared for. What surprises them is not that they remember you. It is how deeply those memories still affect them. Every reflection seems to lead them back to the same place. The same unanswered questions. The same unspoken emotions. The same message waiting to be sent. And listen to this. The emotions behind the message are beginning to evolve. At first, it was simply about expressing something they never had the courage to say. Now it has become about seeking clarity. They are tired of wondering, tired of imagining possibilities without knowing the truth, tired of carrying conversations in their mind that never happen in reality. The uncertainty that once felt manageable is becoming heavier with every passing day. There have been moments recently when they imagined what it would feel like to finally send the message. Not necessarily because they expect a particular response, but because they crave relief from the emotional pressure that has been building for so long. They imagine the freedom that might come from honesty. They imagine what it would feel like to stop hiding behind silence and simply allow the truth to exist. Those thoughts have become increasingly difficult to ignore. What makes this stage so significant is that they are starting to understand a powerful truth. Staying silent does not erase feelings. It only postpones dealing with them. Every day they remain quiet. The emotions continue growing beneath the surface. Every day they avoid the message. The reasons for sending it become stronger. And slowly, they are reaching a point where silence feels more painful than vulnerability. The internal pressure has become impossible to overlook. The message is no longer sitting quietly in the background, waiting for attention. It is demanding attention. The feelings behind it are demanding honesty. And for the first time, they are beginning to question whether holding back is actually helping them at all. Because while fear once gave them reasons to stay silent, their heart is now giving them reasons to speak. Now they find themselves imagining possibilities they once avoided. They imagine what could happen if they finally took that step. They imagine hearing your voice again, receiving a response, or simply knowing they were brave enough to be honest. Whether those possibilities lead to answers, closure, or something entirely unexpected no longer matters as much as it once did. What matters is that the need to express themselves has become stronger than ever before. And as that emotional pressure continues building, they are starting to realize that the message they have been afraid to send may not remain unsent for much longer. And listen to this, because your soulmate is approaching a point where keeping everything inside is becoming harder than facing the possibility of what comes next. For months, maybe even longer, they have managed to convince themselves that silence was the responsible choice. They told themselves they needed more time. They told themselves they needed more certainty. They told themselves they would know the right moment when it arrived. But now, something has shifted. The excuses that once felt convincing are no longer providing the same comfort. The reasons they used to stay silent are starting to lose their strength. What makes this moment so important is that they are no longer asking whether they should send the message. Instead, they are asking themselves how much longer they can continue holding it back. That is a very different question. When someone is deciding whether to act, there is still room for hesitation. But when someone starts wondering how much longer they can resist acting, it means a decision is already forming beneath the surface. And that is exactly where they find themselves now. Lately, the message has been appearing in their thoughts almost every day. Sometimes they rewrite it in their mind. Sometimes they imagine different ways the conversation could begin. Sometimes they picture your response. Other times, they simply sit with the feeling that there is something important they need to say. No matter how the thought arrives, it always leads them back to the same realization. The silence is no longer bringing them peace. In fact, it may be creating more emotional tension than the message itself. And listen to this. One of the biggest changes happening inside them is that fear is slowly losing control of the situation. The fears still exist. They still wonder about rejection. They still wonder about timing. They still wonder whether things have changed too much. But those fears are no longer the loudest voice in the room. Another voice is becoming stronger. A voice that values honesty over certainty. A voice that values truth over comfort. A voice that keeps reminding them that some questions can only be answered through action. There have been moments recently when they felt incredibly close to reaching out. Moments when their finger hovered over the screen. Moments when they stared at the message and imagined what would happen if they finally pressed send. Each time they felt a mixture of nervousness and relief. Nervousness because they cannot control the outcome. Relief because the possibility of finally expressing themselves feels like setting down a weight they have been carrying for far too long. What surprises them most is that they are beginning to focus less on the response and more on the act of being honest. In the past, fear of the unknown kept them trapped. Now they are starting to understand that uncertainty exists, whether they send the message or not. The difference is that one path leaves them wondering forever, while the other offers the possibility of clarity. That realization has become incredibly powerful. Now they stand at an emotional crossroads. Behind them is a long period of silence, hesitation, and unanswered questions. In front of them is the possibility of truth, vulnerability, and whatever comes next. The message they have been afraid to send continues calling for their attention, and every day it becomes harder to ignore. Because deep down, they are beginning to understand something they resisted for a very long time. The message is not demanding to be sent because of impatience. It is demanding to be sent because it carries something real. And the more they acknowledge that truth, the closer they move toward the moment when silence finally gives way to courage. And listen to this, because after all the hesitation, all the fear, and all the countless moments spent wondering whether they should reach out, your soulmate is finally arriving at a realization they can no longer avoid. The message they have been carrying is not important because of the specific words inside it. It is important because of the truth behind those words. For so long, they focused on crafting the perfect message. They worried about timing. They worried about how it would be received. They worried about every possible outcome. But lately, they are beginning to understand that the deeper issue was never the message itself. The deeper issue was finding the courage to be honest about what they feel. For a long time, silence gave them a sense of protection. As long as they remained quiet, they could avoid vulnerability. They could avoid uncertainty. They could avoid the possibility of disappointment. But what they never expected was that silence would eventually become its own kind of burden. The feelings did not disappear. The questions did not disappear. The desire to communicate did not disappear. Instead, all of those things continued growing beneath the surface until they became impossible to ignore. Lately, they have been reflecting on how much energy it takes to hold back something that wants to be expressed. Every unsent thought, every unfinished conversation, every emotion that remains hidden creates a weight that slowly accumulates over time. And now they are reaching a point where carrying that weight feels harder than the risk of setting it down. That realization has changed everything, because once a person understands that silence is no longer helping them, it becomes much harder to justify remaining silent. And listen to this. One of the most powerful shifts happening inside them is that they are no longer viewing vulnerability as weakness. For years, vulnerability felt dangerous. It felt like giving up control. It felt like stepping into uncertainty without guarantees. But now they are starting to see it differently. They are beginning to understand that honesty requires courage. Speaking the truth requires courage. Allowing someone to know what is in your heart requires courage. And the more they reflect on that, the more they respect the part of themselves that wants to reach out. There have been moments recently when they imagined what life would feel like after sending the message. Not necessarily because they know what the response will be, but because they know what relief might feel like. Relief from wondering. Relief from carrying unspoken emotions. Relief from constantly replaying the same thoughts without ever taking action. The possibility of that relief has become increasingly attractive. More attractive than the temporary comfort that silence once provided. What makes this moment so significant is that fear is no longer driving the decision. Fear spent a long time controlling the situation. Fear convinced them to wait. Fear convinced them to stay quiet. Fear convinced them that silence was safer. But now another force is becoming stronger. That force is honesty. That force is emotional truth. That force is the realization that some things need to be expressed, not because the outcome is guaranteed, but because the feelings are real. Now they stand closer than ever to a moment they once thought might never come. The message is no longer just an idea. It is no longer just a possibility. It is becoming something that feels necessary. Because after everything they have learned, one truth has become impossible to deny. The silence that once protected them is no longer serving them. The words they have been afraid to send are no longer willing to stay hidden. And as their courage continues growing, they are beginning to understand that the most important step is not knowing what happens next. The most important step is finally allowing the truth to be spoken. Because sometimes the greatest breakthrough comes when a person stops asking whether they should speak and starts realizing they can no longer stay silent.